Hey there, Money Heroes. It's Stephanie, your host and fellow explorer on the Be Your Money Hero podcast. We're diving into the nitty-gritty of personal finance and having real conversations about how money, spirituality, psychology, and our life stories all dance together. This podcast is educational, but I'm not a therapist, and my guests and I cannot offer personalized advice through a podcast. My goal is to create a safe place for you to learn and get curious about yourself and expand the way you've thought about money. So if you're ready, let's dive in. Dr. Carey is a speaker, author, and psychologist. Fondly known as the sensible psychologist, she works with teams, corporate audiences, and dedicated individuals, helping them learn how to skillfully navigate life's inevitable ups and downs. After 22 years in private practice, Dr. Carey brings the latest developments in psychology with easy-to-implement strategies to empower change, improve productivity, and decrease conflict. On a personal note, Dr. Carey works her own program to create a life she really enjoys. One of her favorite pastimes is baking muffins, and if you ask her for your favorite flavor, she just might make them for you. Thank you for being here, Dr. Carey.
Hi, Stephanie. It's great to see you. I'm curious, what would your favorite muffin flavor be?
That's a tough one. It would either
Or scone.
Ooh, scones. Okay, so scones is easy. It's like those cinnamon sugar ones. I love those. As far as muffins, I really like the chocolate chip ones too.
That sounds awesome.
What's your favorite flavor?
I have a lot of favorite flavors, but I think my reigning favorite is chocolate chip orange. So I made scones last weekend that were with orange zest and orange juice in them, and then they had a little bit of chocolate chips. They were yummy.
That sounds delicious. I would definitely try those. So what is it that made you want to become a therapist, and how did you know that this was the work for you?
Oh my gosh. So I figured out very unusually, I do not think this is normal behavior, but when I was 14, I had a very instrumental experience that gave me just clarity of purpose that I wanted to help people for a living. And I was already the type of person who enjoyed taking care of other people. Like, this muffin baking thing is not just a kitschy thing that I use on podcasts. Like, I've actually been the person baking bread for people since I was probably 13 or 14. At the time, it was a really good way of getting out of yard work, but it was also representative of who I am and what I like to do. And I like to feel good, and I like to have other people feel good. And so when I was 14, just had this experience. I was doing a therapeutic horseback riding volunteering gig, and the kiddo who I was assisting on that day had a seizure on top of the horse and fell off literally like into my arms, and we got him righted back on the horse and over to his wheelchair and over to his parents. But there was just something about that experience that made it so clear to me that there were people in the world who would have a hard time helping themselves, and I had some skill in helping, and it just felt like a real privilege to have that be my calling. So,
what was it about therapy specifically that was how you wanted to help people versus all of the different ways?
I decided at that time that I either wanted to be a lawyer or a psychologist. And I then went off to college and chose to become a lawyer. And then I went and actually worked at a law firm. Now, my guess is, had I chosen a different law firm and had a different experience, I could have ended up becoming a lawyer. But I chose to work at the fifth largest law firm in DC. I should have known, based on the nickname of the firm. It was called Cruel and Boring, was the nickname of the firm. That firm is still in existence in DC. I don't remember if it's still the fifth largest, but it was a terrible job. I was pushing paper around. I was billing people an hourly rate that I didn't even make in a day. The whole system just felt crummy, and it became very obvious to me that I was not a person who would do well helping people through paper, right? I wanted to actually help people in person, and so had the realization like, oh, we should go back to school and become a psychologist. So I did.
I love that because there's definitely a huge need, and mental health, I'm so grateful that it's really getting the recognition that it deserves and it's becoming less taboo. And we're breaking down the shame around it because it does take so much vulnerability and effort and thoughtfulness to really get vulnerable with yourself and to work through a lot of those different things. And so I'm glad that more people are starting to recognize the high value that that has and to work through those things.
Absolutely. And I'm also in some ways watching the pendulum swing, in my opinion, a little too far to the other side, right? Like it used to be, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and like you should be able to think your way out of being depressed. Pro tip, that doesn't work. Um, but now we're sort of on the other end of the spectrum where if the tiniest thing makes you uncomfortable, it's like, oh, well, my anxiety keeps me from doing that. First of all, like that's not your anxiety, right? Like we don't want to claim it as a birthright. Like this is, you may have a tendency to have anxiety, you may have a tendency to run anxious, but like let's actually have you be in charge and not have anxiety be making your decisions for you. So I'm sort of constantly helping people like, no, there should not be stigma of going and seeing a therapist. And also, no, you shouldn't be super proud of your pathology. Like everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and let's let ourselves be uncomfortable and have that be okay, because that's actually how we grow and change.
And it takes a lot to sit in that discomfort because I think a lot of times when we, maybe we try to, when we say that our anxiety keeps us from doing something, it's actually an attempt to keep that discomfort at bay. And so we'll
Yes.
use that as an excuse to keep it at bay versus really working through things. And it's the working through things that can really be challenging for a person. And I can speak from my experience. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and you just hit the nail on the head. It's the working through, right? I think a lot of things that I'm hearing more recently is this idea that we are indulging avoidance. So like, oh well, my anxiety keeps me from doing X, Y, or Z. And it's like, no, that means that you're indulging avoidance. And avoidance, we know for sure, actually increases problems. It's super interesting. So if you can notice and label what you're feeling about something, just even the noticing of it and labeling it like, oh, I'm feeling anxious right now, that tends to actually cut the anxiety, which then opens up the playing field for you to figure out what do you want to do about it. So, waiting for ourselves to feel better. One of my favorites is when somebody's like, oh, well, I'll do that hard thing when I'm motivated to do it. No, no, no. Motivation comes at the end of a learning curve, right? Expertise comes at the end of a learning curve. You don't get to be great at something right off the bat, because that just isn't how skill acquisition works, right? Like if you want to get better at something, you have to actually try it out and and then work through the kinks and then get to a place where you have a smoother experience of it. And then you're going to feel, then motivation comes, then expertise comes, then confidence comes. But we're making a big mistake by essentially saying like, oh, I'll wait till I'm confident to try this new thing. The confidence comes in the action, it doesn't come before the action.
Yes. And just thinking through some of these experiences that I've had, there were a couple of thoughts that I've had on this. One is if I am feeling some of that anxiety or irritation or frustration, it helps me to reframe it like, what is this trying to tell me? Versus
Yeah.
judging that emotion or that feeling at all. So if I'm feeling irritated by something that maybe I shouldn't really feel irritated about, or at least not to that level,
Yep.
and I'm like, what is this telling me? Then I can start to, and it helps me to verbally process. So if I, I'll call a trusted friend and be like, this thing is really irritating at me, and I don't know why it feels like that. And also understanding what values are really important to me. So, as an example, I saw somebody cut in line in front of a group of people this last weekend, and I was really irritated by that. And I was like, why am I this irritated? Like, yeah, it doesn't have anything to do with me. It's not my stuff. Why is this so irritating? And I was able to connect it. It was irritating to me because I value the way that how we make other people feel. Because
Yeah.
people might not remember what we said or what we did, but they're going to remember how we feel. And so that was what it was. And then it linked back to like something else that was bothering me. So I was able to make those connections and then decide what I was going to do about it. And so it's
Yep.
sitting in that discomfort and also pulling yourself out of the judgment of it so that you can
Yes.
more what's the right word, just kind of look at it from a different perspective.
I call it doing an assessment, right? I can get very exacting when particularly if I'm frustrated with something and it's not my favorite version of myself, right? I talk all the time about psychological flexibility and all of that, and I love it when that version of myself shows up. But sometimes the sharper version of me shows up, and I try really hard to keep that under wraps. But but when that version of me shows up, it's normally because one of my values is getting pushed on, and then if I can get out of judgment, this is bad, this shouldn't happen, right? I should have this guaranteed outcome. And I can get away from those judgmental thoughts and reactions and get into like, well, what's working right now and what isn't working right now? What is really happening right now? And what was what did I want to have happen right now? And then looking at the gap between those two things and doing that assessment instead of judgment tends to give you a lot more freedom because then you have a lot more options. If something is good or bad, then you have really narrow options.
Yes, I love that aspect of it. And one of the questions that I was really interested to ask you was if you were going to do a TED talk right now without any prep or anything, like what is one of those topics that you would be able to just talk about all day?
So I have a couple, but the one that comes to mind first is that I have this invention that I call the boundary castle. And it was actually inspired by a crystal that I found when I was out shopping with my daughter at a little fair. And this crystal, unfortunately, our audio only folks can't see it, but it's essentially it looks like a castle, right? But it's made out of a crystal, the name of which I can't remember. It's green and white and cool looking. But this notion of the boundary castle is, I think that we have really kind of messed up how we're talking about boundaries. So my daughter showed me this TikTok video, and it was this girl and her hands were on her hips and she looked super pissed and aggressive. And she's like, I set a boundary. I told them no. Right. And she had like just the gnarliest expression on her face and she's shouting and the whole thing just looked terrible to me. And I said to my daughter, I was like, that's not setting a boundary. That's a video about somebody being a jerk. And she was like, well then what's a boundary? Right? She's like, isn't a boundary telling someone what they can't do? And I said, no. Technically, boundaries are your limits and they're invitations into different levels of connection. And this is where the boundary crystal castle idea came, was like, who goes into your second floor bedroom? Preferably it should only be like your partner and maybe your kids and maybe your dog. And but like this isn't like, I tell the joke like, it shouldn't be your accountant. It's not that type of party, right? And so we tend to either be like shoving people all the way off the grounds, right? Because they've done something that we don't like, or we've invited people into our bedrooms in a way that like we shouldn't be doing. And so the boundary castle is the idea of taking a look through your relationships and figuring out who gets to be the very closest to you. Who do you prefer to keep? Who needs to be a courtyard friend, right? who's somebody who's out on the grounds and who's somebody that actually is a hard pass, right? They don't get your time and attention anymore, maybe because they've been abusive or they've been deliberately unkind or they stole from you, right? Like deal breaker behavior should be the folks who get shoved all the way out. But for the other folks, it's really contingent on us to think about how close do I want this person to be? And then how do I let them know where my limits are? So that would be my TED talk.
I would listen to that TED Talk and I would share that TED Talk a lot because, you know, my background in growing up in a cult and being told that I didn't have the right to have boundaries, essentially, boundaries were really hard for me to learn and for me to understand that they weren't selfish. And my husband was such a huge help in that, and that he told me, like, one of the biggest aha moments that I've had was he told me that if I didn't put boundaries in place, I was going to let people run over me and then I would end up resenting them. And when he said that, it was just a light bulb moment because I'd seen that happen where I'd help and help and do all these things and do all these things. And then I'd get to a point where I literally just could not do it anymore. And I would completely disconnect and the relationship would just be done. Whether
And you were probably simmering in resentment, right?
for sure. Yes.
Yeah.
And so when he said that, I was able to shift the perspective that I had on boundaries, that boundaries are not something that I am doing to be selfish. It's something that I'm doing to protect the relationship.
Yes. It was a cool quote a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, and I do not remember who said it. So my apologies. If someone can credit it in the comments, that's great. But it was something along the lines of boundaries set the distance in our relationship so I can enjoy you and me. I thought it was a really cool quote.
Yeah.
And I think about like your experience growing up in a cult. One of the hallmark symptoms of a cult is that people aren't allowed to have boundaries. They aren't allowed to say no. They aren't allowed to say, like, here's where I begin and here's where you end. All of that is incredibly characteristic of a deeply unhealthy relationship.
And the work that Brene Brown has done too is so helpful for me, and it being able to kind of discover the verbiage around it, like the work that she's done was just, it's been invaluable to me. And learning boundaries, I feel like it's not something that you just get one day, right? And then you're magically, beautifully boundaried. It's a practice. And it takes
Yes.
some time to experiment and kind of figure out how to put those boundaries in place. And sometimes the pendulum does swing a little bit when you're trying to put those boundaries in. You might look like a little pissed off teenager with her arms on her hips, but through that practice, you can kind of find that balance a little bit. But what are some practices that someone could use or tips that you might have when someone is just beginning to see that they feel that resentment and they don't have the boundaries in place that they would like to, and they want to get to that point where they can enjoy both the other person and themselves in that relationship?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is oftentimes when we are increasing our insight, right? We're taking a look at our lives and trying to figure out what's working and what's not working. It can be really easy to be like, well, she isn't doing it right, right? Or I don't like when he does this. So I'm going to tell him to stop. I would encourage you actually to slow down and to take that assessment one step further, which is how have you been participating in enabling somebody else's bad behavior? Now, this does not mean, I want to be crystal, absolutely clear. This does not mean that their bad behavior is your fault at all. But you have a responsibility to take a look at how you're showing up, right? And if you're showing up with somebody who you know is regularly a jerk on purpose and you're surprised that they're a jerk again, then that is actually your need to set a boundary, better boundary, both in terms of taking care of yourself and in disconnecting from that person when that pattern of behavior resurfaces. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think as you're speaking, a picture of my 5-year old kind of pops into my head because she might be, you know, throwing a tantrum, right? And it's okay for her to have her big feelings, but it is not okay for her to hit somebody. And so those are the conversations when you're talking about very rudimentary terms. It is okay for you to do that. It is not okay for you to do this to me. If and I feel like one of the easiest ways to kind of put those boundaries and spaces in place is to provide space if that's possible. So if
Yes.
someone is being verbally abusive, just calmly letting them know it is okay. Like, I understand that you are feeling this way. However, if you're going to continue to swear at me, I'm going to hang up the phone, or we're going to come back to this at another time once the emotion has kind of leveled out.
And some of that also looks like understanding predictable patterns, right? Like if you are talking to someone like you were just describing who gets, you know, activated easily and then they start swearing or calling names, it's great to say quickly, can't swear at me, right? I won't stay on the phone if you swear at me. And then they do it again and you say, I'm going to let you go, right? And then you let them go. So it's not a threat, it's setting a standard of how you will and won't be treated. And then every time the person bypasses the standard, you want to decide if you're going to give them a warning, right? Like with the 5-year-olds, it's probably good to give them some warnings, right? They're still learning. With somebody who you're talking to who's 45, who's behaving like a 5-year-old having a tantrum, you can certainly give them a warning and give them an opportunity, but you're going to train them either that you say that they can't talk to you this way, but then you stay on the phone, which is essentially claiming that you're setting a boundary except you're not, or you say like, I won't be spoken to this way. Do you want to try again? Do you want to call me later? Right? If they're even in a place to answer questions, lots of times it has to be quicker than that. So it's like, I won't be spoken to this way. If it happens again, I'm going to let you go. Oh, yep, I'm going to let you go. I'll call you back. And so it's not judging them and raging back at them for their bad behavior. It's literally just drawing the line and then holding it for yourself. And interestingly, the best boundaries start with self care, where you know who you are and what you stand for and what you don't. And then to know when you get surprised and you have a tantrum, right? Because this all happens to all of us. I teach this stuff all day long, and still occasionally I'm like, could have done that so much better, right? But that slowing down process of taking a look at yourself and knowing who you are and what's okay and what isn't, I think is a really helpful place to start.
Will you talk a little bit more too about when you're setting boundaries, we can't control other people's behavior. And I think that
Correct.
that's maybe a misconception that people have around boundaries is they might say you can't do this. I'm trying to think of a better scenario, but essentially somebody will say this is your behavior and you need to change it, and they can
Yep.
give that warning, but also know that you can't control that other person. You can only ever control your response to it. Would you talk a little bit about that?
And I think it's tricky because a lot of times, and even if you noticed just a minute ago, I shifted my language from you can't swear at me to I won't be spoken to this way. You can't swear at me is technically setting a boundary, but it's one that's based in that notion of control. I won't be spoken to this way is a more clear boundary because it's essentially telling someone about the line that you won't tolerate instead of a behavior that you've decided is bad of theirs, right? And you can set, there are some ways to set boundaries that are certainly constraining people's behavior. So things like, hey, Thanksgiving dinner, in the invite, in the group text of like, here's Thanksgiving dinner this year. I'm really excited about it. And by the way, it's an election year. We're not going to do any politics at the table. So that is setting a boundary. That is also constraining other people's behavior. So you want to be thoughtful about when are you setting boundaries and deliberately constraining other people's behavior. You've given them fair warning, and it's okay to set the stage, and it's okay to have standards like that. And when is it important for you to just really slow down and determine what your response is to someone pushing on your limits? And that actually is I think that's a more fruitful place to pay attention, because the only people that we have control over are ourselves. And even that sometimes is dicey.
One thing that I think can trip people up a bit when they are starting to put these boundaries in place is they may state that boundary, like you had just given an example of, if you're on the phone and you say, if you speak to me like that, I'm going to go ahead and I'll call you back later. But then they stay on the phone, right? Are there any tools or tricks or methods that people can use to actually help with the follow through?
Yes. And a piece of that is visualizing the pattern beforehand. Then you will have more skill in your response because you've already practiced it mentally in your head. Now, interestingly, we will often practice mentally telling somebody off, right? If they do this, I'm going to say that, right? And that's all bravado, and that's lovely, and that's cute, but it doesn't actually help you practice for what you're really going to do. And if what you're really going to do is say, won't be spoken to this way. Oh, yep, I got to go. And then your job is to take the 10,000-pound phone and find the button that says terminate call and actually press it, right? And press it without a flurry of swear words and all of the things, right? Like you just say, oh, gotta go. Because when you're setting a boundary and you're following through with it for yourself, it's actually kind of calm because you've already decided, like, no, I don't do name calling. No thanks. And some of this gets trickier, right? Like it gets trickier when you're setting boundaries with somebody who you really care about, who maybe has good intentions, right? My sweet mom, we're coming to go and visit my parents, and they are awesome. And I'm very excited to go see them. And there's about a million things about the trip that I'm looking forward to. But my mom is bummed that we aren't coming for longer. And so, how do you set boundaries with somebody who you love, who you're excited to see, who you don't want to hurt their feelings? And at the same time, it's also really important to me to get back and have a day before I go back and dig into work. And so that sounds really different than the girl in the TikTok video, right? It's a little bit more like, Mom, that's so sweet that you want us to stay longer. And that doesn't work for me this trip. And then when it comes up again, say, Mom, I think we've already talked about this. Not able to stay longer this trip. And if it comes up again, then it might be like, hey, Mom, this is this is really hard for me that you keep bringing this up. So that boundary is a lot softer. Like the delivery on it's a lot softer. But the boundary itself of I would like to have time before I go back to work, that's actually the boundary I'm holding. How I'm communicating it doesn't have to be super firm, in part because the reason it's getting pushed is such a sweet reason. My mom wants to spend more time with me. That's absolutely awesome, right?
Mhm.
So, do you have people it's harder to set boundaries with because you love them to pieces and you just want them to feel good?
I think that everybody has those people in their lives. And I think that guilt is another thing that I see that will play into it that kind of keeps people from keeping those boundaries with the people that they love. Um,
Yep.
how do you help people kind of release part of that guilt in holding their boundaries?
So the interesting thing about guilt is guilt and shame they're very interesting emotions, right? One is about like I'm not okay, I'm not good enough, and one is I did something wrong. And guilt is the one where it's like I'm doing something wrong. I made the wrong choice with my trip home, right, is where the guilt comes in. And my mom, for the record, is not trying to guilt me into something. She's trying to ask for something more. And there's other people, who might actually be putting a guilt trip on you on purpose. Those I tend to recommend that you just resist wholeheartedly. But it's a great time to, again, go back to that notion of an assessment. Did I do anything wrong here? Or am I responding to somebody's hurt feelings? In this case, I didn't do anything wrong. It's okay for me to have this desire. And I can also hear what my mom is asking for. And so my job then is to say what I am willing to do. Let's schedule another trip. Let's figure out a time for you to come visit. Let's, right? Like there's some solutions here, but that notion of guilt, like the problem with guilt is it tends to keep us in negative judgment of ourselves instead of slowing down and taking a look at, like, where did I do well? Where did I do poorly? Is there something I would do differently next time? So that then you can notice the emotion, but then again, transform it into action, transform it into learning, transform it into action. That's, emotions are here to give us information. Our job then is to figure out what we want to do with that information.
And I think I love that you brought up giving other options that are within your boundaries, because for me, that's a big way that I provide an alternative. So if a friend, maybe they want us to come out for lunch, and I'm like, you know what, I'm sorry, we can't do that. But I could do a video call, or if we do it next month, then I would be able to come down for 4 hours. And so, giving other things within those boundaries, I think that that's probably another misconception around boundaries, is that it's just a firm wall that, kind of like a black and white type of situation. But there can be some flexibility within those boundaries that is healthy.
Absolutely. And that's a piece of why I use that boundary castle metaphor, is because almost everybody can visualize a castle and they can see the difference between second floor, first floor, courtyard, grounds, and distant grounds beyond the moat. Um, I didn't actually understand that moats were real when I was younger. And then I finally went over to Europe and saw moats in action. And I was like, oh my gosh, this isn't just a thing in the movies. This is so cool. They're real and they're huge. Um, but but that notion of figuring out, like, today I'm not in a space to have lunch or to have somebody in that first floor level of connection, but next month or next week, or I'm pretty sure I would be. And so it's figuring out, like, and being able to say out loud, like, now isn't the right time and I'd like to do this later.
And that makes me think of another question. Do you have some examples of where people have struggled with boundaries within their work or within their jobs, and ways that they can handle it? So maybe they're asked to pick up another shift, or if they can take on a project, or if they can cover for somebody. Would you mind walking through a couple of scenarios and how they could be handled?
Absolutely. And I think one of the important things is that it is critically important at work, both for the employer to have standards of conduct and for the employee to have boundaries as well. So things like, one of my first jobs in the Wayback Time Machine was at a residential treatment center. They do very good work in Denver. They're actually still in business. And they help very deeply troubled teenagers, often who have been removed from their homes for desperate cases of abuse. And it's a very challenging population. And one of the standards that they set, and they were quite serious about, was in the job interview, they would say, this is not a job, this is a lifestyle. And so they set the standard in the expectation for what work would be like there very clearly and in the first interview. And then they gave the example. And what we mean by lifestyle is, you may have a shift from 3 to 11, but if there's something major going on at the house, you may not leave until 2 in the morning. And here's how we compensate you for that, right? So they had the standard. This is a lifestyle, not a job. They gave an example of what it would be like. And then they also talked about how they accounted for when your boundaries would get pushed, right? And so then what that look like as a staff member would be to say, hey, here's my week, right, coming up. And if something happens at the shelter on Tuesday, I have company that's coming into town that I have to pick up at the airport. And just know that I'll need some backup coverage because I won't be able to push my shift to 2 hours. And sometimes that was okay, and sometimes it wasn't okay, right? But it's an example of the intersection of standards at work and boundaries from an employee coming together. And sometimes that needed to be a negotiation when they didn't quite match up.
The expectations piece of it is, I don't think that can be understated, because if you're working in a situation like that, it's just, regardless of what work you are doing or what type of company, I think that if you are running a department or if you are running a company of your own or you're a manager, like having those expectations that people can align with so that they can really truly decide if that is something that they want. I've seen it just work so much more smoothly when those expectations are managed.
Absolutely. And I think in general that there's some unreasonable expectations, particularly for overwork, that need to be paid attention to, in part because they increase burnout. And once your employees are burned out, then you're not getting good performance. So, one of my encouragements when I do speak with employers and I train leadership teams is we'll talk about what their expectations are and then take a look at how realistic they are. And to take a look at the reality of, like, oh well, you want X, but your employees are telling you that they will only do Y. Then we have a pretty big disconnect here, and we need to figure out, is the employer's standard unreasonable, or is the employee's level of entitlement too high? And so how do we work with both of those things and help the employees feel well cared for, but also help the employers not feel like they're getting substandard work? And if folks are willing to have a conversation, it goes better. And if folks are willing to be really clear about the standards from the very beginning, and to be clear when things aren't going well on either side and have a conversation about it, then you can collaborate and really come up with some creative solutions, which is awesome.
I feel like we could do a whole nother podcast on just that topic alone.
Probably.
So let's switch to a different scenario. Let's say that you have, let's say, a high school employee, or maybe they've just graduated, they've started their first job. It's one of, maybe it's at a restaurant or a department store, and they're being continually asked to pick up shifts and things along those lines. What is a good way to take care of yourself, but also communicate those boundaries in a way that is professional and well received?
Yes. So the first is to check in with yourself and see if what you're asking for is realistic, right? I had an example of, these actually were not high school employees. These were full grown adults who were willing to work from 9 to 2 and demanding 40-hour-a-week paychecks. So that was a great example of the employees needing to check themselves because what they were asking for was not a reasonable expectation. So, step one, check yourself, make sure what you're asking for is reasonable. Step two is to understand, particularly when you're in an entry level job, you have less power and you have less control. And that's one of the things that makes those entry level jobs harder, is you're in a position of less power, and that can play out with employers not treating their employees very well. And so that's a piece of where it's a great idea to certainly check out with the employer if what they're asking, if they understand that what they're asking is unreasonable. And if it is, then to start figuring out what other options you have. Because sometimes speaking up and setting boundaries, they just get rolled through either personally with another person or at an institutional level with an employer that you're working for. And folks who are willing to run through boundaries and don't care about you, they're going to really stink to work for long term. So if you can kind of get your resume in order and start looking for other options, I tend to recommend it.
And we have another podcast episode that talks about resumes, so you can check that one out if that's you.
That is fantastic.
I also wanted to talk to you because I know that you have so much knowledge and just expertise in the area of resilience. And so I want
Yep.
to make sure that we touch on that too. How do you define resilience?
I define resilience as the ability to bounce back from life's inevitable difficulties.
So, how does someone build resilience?
A piece of it is actually going back to what we were talking about and touched on in the beginning of our podcast, which is identifying your values. So, figuring out what is most important to you, right? And then slowing down and really taking good care of yourself, taking a look around your life and doing that assessment. What's working well? What is not working well? What am I good at? What am I not so good at, right? What takes me what are difficult situations that I have an easy time handling? What are difficult situations where I kind of fall to pieces? And then once you've done that assessment, and again, it's an assessment, not a judgment. This is not an invitation for you to beat yourself up. It's just an invitation to take a look around and see where are your strengths and where are the things that are a little harder for you. And then from there, then you can build more skills in your responses. And that helps you be more resilient.
And you've talked a bit about mindset too, and shifting from like a victim mentality. So for me, the victim mentality, and I talk about this in my book, was when I was really struggling financially. And one of these light bulb moments that I've had in my life was we had this cherry red hearse that was always dying. It was a bright cherry red car that I just despised, and I had to go in after work and get yet another piece for this car. My two
Yep.
girls were very young. They were very hangry and so very grouchy. And as I was walking out, I found myself mumbling under my breath that, I couldn't go get a second job to make our financial situation better because their parent wouldn't watch the kids. And like, I realized what I was doing in that moment. I was making myself the victim. I was shifting all of the blame for my circumstances to someone or something else.
Yep.
And if we stay in that, we're never going to change it because we never have any power, or we perceive that we don't have any power.
Yeah, we don't have any options, right? If life is just happening to you, then that's really tricky. And so getting into choice mode. So I think of the opposite of being in victim mode as being in choice mode. And getting into choice mode, the central question to ask is what's my next best move? And I think it's really important again, like this is not an invitation for people to be hard on themselves or to be unkind to themselves. We all, myself included, end up in victim mode sometimes and feeling like things are happening to us. And sometimes things are happening in our world that we didn't ask for, that we don't want, that we don't approve of. And yet, if we can be in acceptance, okay, this is what is. What's my next best move? Instead of, this is what is, it's terrible, I feel terrible, I have no options, right? Notice that acceptance of what is, and then figuring out what options do I have? And sometimes your options are really small and really narrow, right? If you're in that job where you are being mistreated at work and you've done your work and you're with a really crummy boss or whatever, it is true that you're in a crummy job. And what's one thing that you could do that day to move yourself one step closer to being in a better job, right? And it doesn't mean it's going to happen right away. But so that's a piece of the whole victim mode thing is you're in it when you're starting either to blame other people for your circumstances or you're feeling like life is happening to you and the question you keep asking is why me. You're up in choice mode even if circumstances really stink. You're in choice mode when you're like, man, this is happening, I don't like it, this isn't what I want, and what's my next best move?
What are some different methods that you use to take that assessment? So it could be like one of the ways that I assess is through writing. So I'll write
Yep.
down what my circumstances are, what my ideal situation would be, and then I can be like, okay, what's one thing that I can do today to put me down that path? What are some other ways that people can take that assessment?
I think that writing is a great idea. And I think what you nailed on the head is the first step, which is noticing that something is making you feel really uncomfortable. And then asking yourself the question, like, is this healthy, good discomfort? Right? Like, I'm currently sitting here thinking of how sore my legs are from leg day yesterday. My trainer crushed me. um, but that's good discomfort, right? If I was sitting here and I had a broken leg, that would be bad discomfort. So it's like taking a look at what's making you feel uncomfortable and doing that, taking a peek. Like, is this healthy? Is this moving me in a good direction? Is it too much? Okay, if it's too much, then what do I want to do about it? How long do I put up with this? What do I do differently? Any of my clients who are doing things like they're in med school, they feel uncomfortable for like years at a time. That's okay because they know they signed up for it, right? And then they can care for themselves as well as they can, knowing that they've signed up for this.
There's so many different, we all want things, I think, to be very black and white, and unfortunately that's just not the reality in life. And so there's just so many different shades of all of the colors within that black and white. And so I think that it is one, the thing that keeps coming up is knowing your values, because when
Yes,
you know your values and what is most important to you, that can act as your north star in guiding you through some of these decisions. It helps you
absolutely.
keep healthy boundaries. It helps you decide what your priorities are in your work. It helps you decide if you're, because we're all going to have seasons where life is just uncomfortable and difficult sometimes. Whether you're going through med school or whether you're paying off debt or whatever the case may be, there's just going to be periods of discomfort in our lives. But knowing where your values stand and how you are aligned to those really help you to decide if something needs to be changed or if this is going to have a greater payoff down the road.
And it gives you an opportunity to decide how you want to show up, regardless of how someone else is showing up, right? And that's so powerful to decide, like, well, here's the type of daughter I want to be, or here's the type of mom I want to be, here's the type of worker I want to be. Um, and then checking in with yourself, like, how close am I to how I want to be showing up? And if you feel like you've gotten a little far afield from how you want to show up, again, regardless of someone else's response, but that then puts the empowerment back on you to then choose differently the next interaction that you have.
I appreciate all that you have shared. I think that this conversation has been amazing. And I would like to move into some closing questions, but the first one is, where can people find you?
Awesome. Selfhelponthego.com. It is my website. It is also the title of my book, selfhelponthego.com.
Thank you. And what does abundance mean to you?
Oh my gosh. Abundance is all about freedom for me, spaciousness.
Will you say more?
I'll give you an example. So, my husband and I have been doing what we call drop in brunches. And so, on Sundays, I love to cook for other people. It's sort of my love language. And it feels amazing to have enough freedom and spaciousness on a Sunday that we can invite people over and we can have whoever shows up and they can go home well fed and feel like they had nice connection and good conversation and just a nice place to land. That feels like abundance to me.
I love that one. What's one of the biggest aha moments you've had in your life?
Oh, that I am so not perfect and that is okay. I tried for a very long time to always do everything right and ended up feeling very exhausted and very hard on myself. And So giving myself a little bit more leeway. I give other people a lot of leeway, but I was not giving it to myself. So figuring that out was a big aha.
I can relate to that one. I've had to work through some of those things myself. Dr.
Yeah.
Carey, thank you so much for being here with me. I appreciate your time and the work that you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
As we wrap up this episode of Be Your Money Hero, remember that your financial journey is a path of self-discovery. If you have questions that you would like answered on the show, please submit them to info@beyourmoneyhero.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, share your thoughts and insights with our growing community. Subscribe for more empowering discussions, and always remember, you have the power to be your money hero. Until next time, keep growing, money heroes.